Hey everyone, Brandon here from TruckSafe. Vetting commercial drivers to ensure they're properly qualified is one of the foundational regulatory obligations that's placed on motor carriers by the federal and state safety regulations. There's a lot that goes into qualifying drivers, but there's one aspect in particular that seems to cause quite a bit of confusion, and that's the so-called verification of employment or safety performance history request process. That's what we're discussing in this video, so stay tuned and do us a favor by hitting those like and subscribe buttons below. So to kick things off here, the federal motor carrier safety regulations and related state rules generally require motor carriers to conduct two kinds of background investigations on driver applicants during the onboarding and the qualification process. The first, which applies to all applicants, involves obtaining a motor vehicle record, or MVR, from every state in which the applicant has held a driver's license, or CDL, within the 3 years preceding their application date. The second, and the subject of this particular video, involves making safety performance history inquiries with the applicant's previous DOT-regulated employers. Importantly, this requirement applies only to driver applicants who have previous CMV driving experience within the 3 years preceding their application date. Drivers who have no commercial driving experience in the 3 years preceding their application date require no verification of employment under DOT regulations. Now, the pertinent regulatory text from 49 CFR 391.23 says, each motor carrier shall make the following investigations and inquiries with respect to each driver it employs. An investigation of the driver's safety performance history with DOT-regulated employers during the preceding 3 years. Now, both the MVRs and the safety performance history inquiries must be made within 30 days of the driver's hire date. However, many carriers choose to complete them prior to allowing the drivers to operate commercial vehicles. With respect to the previous employer safety history inquiries, prospective carrier employers must obtain written consent from the driver applicants to make these requests, and those consents must accompany the request sent to the previous employers. Okay, so what exactly must carriers be verifying about their prospective drivers? Well, there are essentially two main categories of information that must be verified, and a third that we'll discuss a little later. The first two main categories are verifications of, number one, the employment dates, and number two, accident information. Specifically, Section 391.23E of the Federal Safety Regulations says that prospective employers must investigate, number one, general driver identification and employment verification information, and number two, accident data for any accidents in which the driver was involved in the past 3 years. All right, so about that third category I mentioned. The regulation goes on to require carriers to verify certain information about the driver applicant's drug and alcohol testing history. Importantly, however, these additional verifications apply only to drivers who are applying to operate vehicles that do not require a CDL. Why is that the case? Well, it's because for drivers who will be operating vehicles requiring a CDL, the prospective employer is, as of January 2020, required to obtain that information through the Federal Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, rather than from the previous employers directly. We've discussed the clearinghouse at length in other videos, so be sure to check those out if you haven't already. For applicants of non-CDL positions, carriers must make the following additional verifications of previous DOT employers for whom that applicant worked in the 3 years preceding the application date. Number one, whether within the previous 3 years that driver had violated the alcohol and drug prohibitions. Number two, whether the driver failed to undertake or complete a rehabilitation program prescribed by a substance abuse professional, or SAP. And number three, for a driver who had successfully completed an SAP's rehabilitation referral and remained in the employ of the referring employer, information on whether that driver had any subsequent drug and alcohol violations. All right, so that's the breakdown of what information must be obtained, but how far back are prospective carriers to go? Well, the regulations require prospective motor carriers to send safety performance history requests to any DOT employer for whom a driver applicant worked in the 3 years preceding the application date. It's a common misconception that carriers must verify employment going back 10 years, but that's a conflation of a different rule that dictates how much employment history a CDL applicant must list on his DOT application. That rule does not require prospective carriers to send these safety performance history requests to previous employers beyond 3 years. We broke down that myth in a different video, so be sure to check that out. Okay, so lastly, let's talk about responses to these verifications. First of all, another common misunderstanding is that motor carriers have to make a certain number of attempts to reach a driver applicant's previous employers to conduct the required investigations. That's not all that accurate. The regulations merely require carriers to make a reasonable effort to reach previous employers. They don't prescribe a particular number of attempts. That said, many carriers like to make at least 2 attempts to do so, which we think is reasonable. The key is that prospective employers document their efforts to reach previous employers and keep copies of those records in the driver qualification files. Now, what if you're a carrier that's on the receiving end of one of these requests? Do you have to respond to them? Well, the regulations say yes. Specifically, previous employers must respond to each request for the DOT-defined information within 30 days after the request is received. If there's no safety performance history information to report for that driver, the previous motor carrier employers are nonetheless required to send a response confirming the non-existence of any such data, including the driver identification information and dates of employment. Carriers that fail to provide the requested information are subject to enforcement. Okay, to wrap things up here, safety performance history requests are a key component of the driver qualification process. Information gleaned from these requests should be used by prospective employers to ensure driver applicants are qualified to operate. Failing to adhere to this process can lead to regulatory violations and heightened exposure in highway accident litigation. For even more in-depth information on these types of regulatory topics, be sure to check out our innovative online compliance courses for safety managers and for drivers over at trucksafeacademy.com. Also, be sure to check out our detailed compliance articles on our website at trucksafe.com and follow us on our various social media channels for the latest highway transportation news and analysis. Thanks for watching.